You're listening to B2B Tech Talk with Ingram Micro, the place to learn about new technology and technological advances before they become mainstream. This episode is sponsored by Ingram Micro Security. Strengthen your security practice. Let's get into it.
Welcome to B2B Tech Talk with Ingram Micro. I'm your host, Carrie Roberts, and my guest today is JC Vega, an executive security advisor and cyber range coach at IBM. Welcome, JC. Thanks for being here today.
Glad to be here, Carrie. Thank you for having me.
Now, JC, I was reading about you. You were in the Army for almost 30 years, and now you're with IBM. What would you say your military experience has taught you about cybersecurity that those who weren't in the military might not know?
Well, that's a great question. After 30 years, you're bound to learn something. And one thing that the military stresses, being that it's such a large organization, is it stresses centralized planning, but decentralized execution. But to do that, you hear that a lot in management, and you plan, but everybody else executes the plan. But there's more to it than that. The idea that there's a methodology and an established practice, that is what I really learned in the military, is you gotta have these processes in place so that people could buy into the plan and know what's expected. One of the most important things is you have to have a clearly defined mission or task that everybody understands. But that's not just, it doesn't just start and end there. There's an entire process. You have time usually to build a team. So how do you build a team? What are the things that team values? One of the most important traits or attributes in the military is trust, mutual trust from the leaders, the subordinates, the peers left and right of you, organizations that are left and right of you. You're expecting them to do a job so that you don't have to do their job, and that you have a level of confidence as you move forward that the mission is going to be accomplished. You have to have the ability to create a shared understanding across call it the battle space or your area of operation. And that translates to the business world as well. You got to have this shared understanding of what's important, what's valuable, and what everyone is expected to do. And then we have this concept of providing a clear commander's or leader's intent. That's a concept we can have this whole podcast cover all in itself. But the idea behind that is it defines what success is for the organization or the operation or this particular mission. It doesn't tell you how to do it. It doesn't tell you what to do. It says what the end state and what your boundaries are to achieve that end state. So, for instance, we say the idea is to protect our customers. From the CISO's perspective, that means one thing, the Chief Information Security Officer. But from the business lines, those who may be the ones initially taking in information from the customer, that means they have a shared responsibility in that. It is not just the IT folks or the security people's responsibility to protect the information. It's the organization's responsibility. And everybody will do it differently based on their area of responsibility. And again, there's other attributes to that, but the idea that having these processes codified and then you mature them to where they become very efficient and you try to find ways to do this faster, quicker, observe something, and be able to adjust as necessary so that you could accomplish the mission. And you practice that over and over and over and over again. So probably the biggest thing that I learned is you got to have processes, you got to have a methodology, and you have to practice. We say train like you fight and fight like you train, because when it really gets hairy, when it really gets interesting, you're going to revert back to how you were prepared to respond to a situation.
That makes a lot of sense. And I know from other people I've spoken with in military, they always talk about the camaraderie between everybody, which I think the other thing you're talking about is really this sense of teamwork within the organization. Like you said, it's not just the CISO's job, it's really everybody's job. And most organizations have a plan to protect people in the workplace, but what if there is a security failure at home? Can you share with us what would be an example of the most likely scenario that could happen, maybe best and worst case?
Well, given the current situation that we have, not just across our nation, but across the world right now with the pandemic, a lot has been turned upside down. In a normal day-to-day operation, the chief security officer would be responsible for the physical security of your building or your infrastructure, protecting people from coming in, or if someone is acting suspicious within your organization. Usually not your IT guy's responsibility, unless it's something that's happening on the network. But now, with everybody working from home, that boundary and that perimeter has been extended to everybody's work from home location. So we went from the corporate fortress to Fort Living Room. And now you're operating in an environment where you have untrusted people from a security perspective operating on a shared network. What do I mean by untrusted? If you have children, do you trust them with your corporate secrets and how they're going to manipulate things on the network and the security of the network? Probably not. And someone said, how do you protect your information from your family members? Well, with kids, you put them on your guest network. And you separate them. You keep them completely isolated so they can't touch your work environment. And why does that matter? Because you just increase the attack surface. What's one of the first things you do when you have visitors that are going to stay for the weekend with you? They ask, what's the password to your network? Now imagine if you were in your corporate office and somebody walks in, a friend of yours or a guest, and they say, what's the password to your network? You would not give it to them. But in some places, in some homes, it's readily given to anybody. Well, that's not a best business practice for security. So you have to account for that. And now you have the chief information security officer responsible for this attack surface that's extending, again, from what used to be the corporate fortress to Fort Living Room. And that is creating a big increase on what we have to do. And some of the scenarios that are happening are just mind-boggling. I'll give you one example. This is not related to the current example of, or the current pandemic that's going on. But there was a point in time where I was living on the military base, and we were in a foreign country in a stable but semi-hostile environment where families were permitted. And I was helping my peers, my colleagues, secure their home networks. And there were two neighbors that were good friends of mine that I was going in there and setting up their networks. I fixed one network and everything was working just fine. They had passwords, they had different access levels, and everything was, at the time, the state of the art of that security that was available for, based on the threat, based on the infrastructure, and it was a good enough solution compared to what they had before. Then the other neighbor calls me and says, hey, I just lost all connectivity to my network. What they didn't realize is that they were sharing the other neighbor's network the entire time. And when I locked it down, I actually locked them out of the network. So the idea that here you have these professionals, not security professionals, but professionals in their own right, that didn't have the basics of security down to where they were actually sharing private networks among themselves and not even aware, because the way the Wi-Fi was set up at the time, it's automatically connect to whatever network's out there, and they happen to have the same type system, routers. So it made it very easy for them to cross-pollinate information. Again, that's probably the worst case scenario. You don't even, from one neighbor's perspective, you don't even know that you have other people that are slaving off of your network. From the other perspective, you don't even understand what networks you're connecting to. And this happens now if you were to go through an area where your device, your mobile device remembers where you had been before and you had given it access before, it will automatically connect. It could be a hotel, it could be public Wi-Fi, the library, it could be Starbucks, but none of that you cannot assume that it is secure. Yet the system is set up to default to connectivity. And you have an active role in that and accepting those terms or those permissions, but you don't necessarily know what you're getting when you do that. So the idea of people working from home, people distributed, and now you just increase the attack surface, and you also it creates vectors for nefarious people to want to take advantage of.
In the situation you just spoke about, how were the neighbors able to get access? Did they have their password before, or was there another way that they got access to it?
In this case here, they didn't have any security set up. So when I became involved, I immediately locked it down and set up passwords for their segmented their network and set up passwords, and nobody could just join. And I took everything that was default and mothballed it and then deactivated it and set everything unique for their home system. That is how the neighbors was set up, also wide open. And their computers would just go to whatever router was convenient to them, depending on where they were in their home, because they were so close to one another. And so when I closed one off, it actually created a denial of service on the other, which it should have all along, but they did not have proper security set up.
Now, along these lines, we're talking about large organizations. A lot of them put focus on protecting the executives, but they don't always protect those around them the same way, kind of similar to the story you told. You suggest that someone who may not think they're important may be surprised to know that they are important in the security world. What does this mean, and who are you referring to when we talk about an organization?
So when I talk about security with a team, we all recognize that the leader is probably the person that is likely to be targeted. And she may have a whole slew of protections afforded to her, but somebody else on the team who is the lowest person on the totem pole, for instance, may not have any protections afforded to them, specifically tailored to their needs and how they operate. Now, using the analogy that many of us have heard of about the 6 degrees to Kevin Bacon, 6 degrees of separation, and how you can find somebody. Well, there's actually research done on that and how they came up with that 6 degrees. And that's a great topic in itself. But the idea is that what is it going to take for you or that leader for her to open an email from someone that she trusts? Now, in the physical presentations that I gave, I used some phishing emails, and I asked the audience, would you open this email? And one of the most effective ones I've seen, given the current situation, is a layoff notice from your organization that said, given the current situation, you are being laid off, with all the right header information from HR, and then it had links in there set up on what to do next. It was very convincing. I would have clicked on that email had I received it. And the idea that you click on that and you now become the victim of a phishing attack. And you may download some software or something that might make you vulnerable to exploitation. Now, you're the lowest person on the totem pole. You open this email. Of course, I'm the one who's likely going to go because I'm the lowest person. And then it says, our mistake, you're fine. Log in here to get more information. And now when you clicked on that initial link, you downloaded the payload or enabled your system to receive information. Now you're the one who is an adversary is going to use as a pivot point to get to somebody else. All they need is somebody to enable the adversary. So what this does here is, why would you attack the most fortified individual? You instead go for the least suspecting one, because that person may not have direct contact with the leader, but they may have contact with the executive assistant or someone in HR. And that HR person has contact with that executive or her executive assistant. And you see how you can quickly escalate, one, your footprint within the organization, your foothold within the organization, and you can start to gain more and more access. But the idea is, find the most unsuspecting person, someone who's going to click on your link. And it doesn't have to be as well organized as or constructed as the example I just gave. It could be something as simple as receiving an email that looks like it's from your children saying, Mom, Dad, I need to reset the password to Netflix. Can you help me? Because that is a crisis, at least in my household. And I'm likely going to answer an email from one of my children and resetting the password for Netflix or any other kind of streaming media is something that is happening repeatedly in households right now, especially now that the threat knows that is how we're using this information. That is how we're operating right now. And we're all bound to our home. And the exchange of information is, they're going to find a way to make that particular note compelling to the receiver. And that's just a start. Again, why would I go for someone who's very protected as opposed to someone who's less protected and more likely to respond to a phishing attack?
Now, you're a professional, and you said, there are sometimes you see stuff and even you almost feel fooled by it. So how is the average person supposed to know the difference without kind of going crazy and thinking everything is either a problem or nothing is? Like, what are some things to look for when they're that well designed?
There's a lot of things you could do to verify that whether something is legitimate or not. But the thing is, it does take some time. It does take some skill to execute all that. So instead, we go by the term that you hear now is zero trust. It used to be trust but verify. Now it's zero trust. I don't trust that my kids are going to send me something. I don't trust that my colleague is going to send me something that isn't nefarious, because they may not be the one sending it. They may be a victim, and now they're just using them as a vector to get to me. And so aside from the very simple thing of having two-factor authentication on when you log into sites, and that means having an alternative way to verify that is required when you log into a secure site. And that could be a text message that you receive. It could be a code that you have memorized that you have to input, or it could be from trusted devices. But there's multiple ways to do that. But the idea is, assume zero trust. Don't open it if you are absolutely not sure of the content, where it's coming from, and what's in there. It doesn't take much to send a text to somebody or reply to somebody. Did you send this? What did you want me to do with this? So in the case of the Netflix, I may have received something on email, but I may respond on a text message instead, to a different mode so that I could understand exactly what they want. Part of it is verification that they in fact did do this. Again, but there's a lot of things that you could do, but you gave the example of the two extremes of don't trust anything or trust everything. Where we are today, being that everything moves at machine speed and moves very fast, I err on don't trust anything. And if it's not coming on a secure site or through secure methods, even simple text messages, we use alternative methods that are secure so that you can't just necessarily hack into those as easily. Does that mean anything is foolproof or everything, there is a silver bullet out there for security? There is not. The user behavior is what is being manipulated the most. That's when we get into what social engineering is to get you to do things that you otherwise wouldn't do to enable an adversary.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I want to talk about open source intelligence for a moment. Can you talk about what it is for those that aren't aware of it, and how does it influence people?
Sure. So open source intelligence is information that resides on the web. Now you have the surface web, you have the deep web, and you have the dark web. The surface web is Google, everything that you can go and search without having to go beyond a password, where you don't have to have any type of authentication to reach it. It's, again, looking at someone's public profile on LinkedIn or Facebook or Instagram or things like Reddit. When you need a password to get into it, now you're getting into the deep web. That's more secure, but some things are still accessible. And then you get into the dark web. That's where you need special tools and a lot more of knowledge on how to navigate through that space. But let's talk about just the surface web. That's the open source intelligence. Anything I can find about an individual and or organization that is open source. In other words, it's available to everybody. And if you think about it, we all do some sort, or most of us do some sort of open source intelligence when we learn about somebody new. If someone requests us as a friend on LinkedIn, a connection, or on Facebook or on Instagram or whatever the latest media is out there, we usually do, if we don't know who they are, we do a quick scan to see how much we can find out about them if we want to accept their request. Now, that takes a few minutes to do. But if you have the time and you have the will and you have the resources, you can really start to dig to find out an entire dossier on a person. I recently did an experiment or an example of a chief security officer for a partner, an organization. And let me caveat this. I did this ethically. I let the individual know that I was going to search for any open source information that I could find on him. I also let him know that if I found anything that would be embarrassing or something that he would not want his professional colleagues to know, that I would share it with him and that he would have absolute right to say, I cannot use anything that I find. And we did that. I had his permission, and then I began to dig. And I called in a couple of friends who, over a chat, we're talking about, hey, let's see what we can find out about this person. And they also required me to get explicit permission. As we did this, we started to create a public persona of this individual, how his colleagues viewed him. But then we started to create a private persona of what were his hobbies? What did he engage in? What was he doing? And how much can I pinpoint his activity? So what were the differences between the two? And again, I shared it with the individual. We went over it, took out anything that might be embarrassing, and then I presented it to an audience with him in the audience. I showed this public persona. This is how you are perceived. And everybody said, yes, we know that he's into music. And they show him in a band. I showed a picture of him in a band that I pulled off the web. They know that he's chief security officer, information security officer. So he's geeking on giving an interview to a television crew. Then I went into his hobbies. It turns out he is very much into online gaming. And I showed that. I showed how he was so much into music that I was able to show all the concerts he had been to by date and location going back several years, because he would post on social media certain things. I was able to link to emails that he hadn't used in years, which took me back more than a decade. I would say probably about almost 20 years, when he was first breaking into his first job, where he had an email, and what he was posting back then. Now imagine when we were in our early 20s, what we were posting way back then. And I was able to trace all that back. I was able to find through public information his family members, their birthdays. I actually found his social security number. And then as I was giving the presentation, I asked him, by the way, that pinging you have in your car, did you ever get that fixed? I think the recommendation was for you to do XYZ. And his jaw dropped, because that was very relevant to him today, but he had no idea that we had that much access to his personal life. We've done this with executives where we can see the schedule of when they're dropping their kids off, who's picking them up, how their day-to-day life occurs. Now think as a nefarious actor, if I want to influence somebody, I have to give you the perception that I can reach out and touch you and reach out and influence the things that are most important to you. In this case, I picked everything about this CISO that he thought was not visible to the rest of the world. He, in fact, paid for services to block all that out. In the other instance with executives, we show just how vulnerable they can be if somebody really wants to influence them and really wants to get in their, let's just say, we call it the OODA loop, the orient, observe, decide, and act. How do I get you to behave in a way where I can observe you and orient all this information about you and force you to do certain things? And I just have to be ahead of you to take advantage of that. So there's a lot of public information out there, your homes, your tax records, that of your neighbors, family members, everything traced from addresses, phone numbers, your activities, emails, everywhere you post. And there's a lot of sites out there that help you do this. So instead of a professional spending hours on this, there are sites out there that make the novice perform like a professional.
Well, I feel creeped out. So I mean, I guess I knew that. I think it's just when you're talking about how much depth there is. So, the big question is, as you're saying, a lot of people are working from home. Everyone's public presence matters more than ever. You're talking a little bit about what the bad guys can do. If you want to elaborate, would love to hear that. But how do we protect ourselves? And I'm curious, we're also in this age of this is how people find out about us. This is how we get opportunities. This is how we get business, is being on social media and doing different things. So how do we do this in a way to attract business and do things in a good way, but how do we still protect ourselves?
So life goes on. And the thing that we stress is risk is ever present. I tell a story to executives about accepting risk, prudent risk in cybersecurity. Number one, you have to understand the risk. Once you understand it, you can mitigate it, you can accept it, or you can underwrite it or pass it on to insure yourself against any kind of risk. And we do this already. A parent of teenagers, I give a story to help to bring it to life. And I ask them, what's one of the biggest risks you've ever taken in your life? And I say that I gave the scenario. Imagine if I told you that you're going to accept some risk that is going to cost you a lot of money, in the thousands of dollars. Every month, you're going to pay a lot more than you're currently paying on top of that initial investment. It's going to keep you up at night. You're going to worry about this constantly. And it is the most likely thing that is going to take the life of your loved one. And when you accept this risk, you're going to celebrate it. You're going to put a big bow on it. You're going to announce it on social media. You're going to have, it's going to be the highlight of this individual's life, perhaps at this point. And I kind of alluded to it a moment ago. The teenager, it's when you give your teenager when they learn to drive, and if you get them their first car or they drive yours, the cost is going to go up for your insurance, the investment in the vehicle itself, worrying when they're driving out there, and statistically, most likely cause of fatalities for young people. And yet we celebrate it. We put a bow on it and we announce it on social media. But there's a lot more to it than that. Number one, they go through training to be a safe driver. You have to do driving with them as well. There's restrictions on where and when and who can drive in the car with them. There's an ecosystem where there's policemen who are also monitoring their driving. There's speed limits, there are rules. The cars are designed like tanks now that are safer than the cars we started with. All kinds of safety devices, backup cameras, airbags on the front, side, above you, beside you, everywhere. And you have safety inspections on the vehicles. And if they do something wrong, your neighbor is apt to tell you. And now you can even track the vehicle and the speed at which they're going. And there's even now apps so that they can't use their phone. They can tell when their eyes are off the road. And there's an entire ecosystem to protect them, because we found that risk is worth assuming under the current circumstances if we do all these things. And then our insurance goes up, we underwrite the risk also. So in cybersecurity, what are the steps that we are taking? What are the risks that we are identifying so that we can protect ourselves? And then you have to think about, what is this culture of a secure behavior? Nobody likes a bad driver. I don't like to receive chain letters, spam from peers or friends or people on social media who are going to send me all these different things. The idea of creating this ecosystem of secure behavior, a culture of secure behavior, starts with you as an individual. It starts with you as a leader. It starts with you as a member of a team. No one else is going to be as vested in security of your loved ones than you. The same goes for your cybersecurity. You have to be vested in it as well.
Is it possible for you to give us, because I said, how can we protect ourselves? If you can give maybe, 3 tips for people that are working from home. Again, we're talking about people that don't necessarily work in security. Maybe they work in marketing or administrative or other things. What are maybe 3 things they can do to protect themselves at home in a work standpoint, cybersecurity wise? That's something easy that they could do.
Sure. All right. So a couple of things that you can do to protect yourself is, number one, isolate your network. The modern router today, you can actually separate different networks, your guest network from your primary network, from your work network. Now, does that mean those cannot be hacked? Yes, they can. But that is step number 1, is separate your network. Number 2, dedicate certain systems, be it your work computer, for work. Don't mix other activities on there. Do not let your work iPad or your work phone be the babysitter for your toddler, where they're clicking everything. Have those things isolated from other users. and then keep your systems up to date. Work with your IT teams from work to ensure that you are getting the latest updates, that you are patched, that you are monitored, to ensure that your system is as up to date as it needs to be based on the criteria set by either your work or yourself. Patches and updates come out constantly. That doesn't mean you have to update everything, but you do have to be aware and enable the updates to take place so that your system will be most secure. And that is not just your computer or your laptop or your desktop. That includes your phone also. And so the idea of keeping your network segmented, keeping your workspace separate and segmented, and keeping those systems up to date are three initial steps that everybody should be doing.
No, I think those are perfect and easy ones that people can start kind of implementing if they haven't already. I think they're really important. I want to talk about something that's kind of top of mind recently. Twitter just recently had a breach. I know there's still some information kind of coming to light. So I'm curious if you can kind of share a little bit about what happened for those that didn't hear, and maybe some thoughts that you have on the incident about what we know so far, maybe what could have been done to prevent it, because a lot of it pertains to what I think we're talking about today.
So first of all, I am not an expert on Twitter, and I am not an expert on their incident that occurred. And apparently many of their high profile accounts of very well-known individuals were breached, where somebody took over the accounts and they were tweeting information based on that persona, and they were requesting Bitcoin of some sort, looking at some of the basic fundamentals of cybersecurity. And if that is something that failed, you know darn right they're re-looking at who has access to their systems. What their motivation was behind that, I don't know. How they were able to influence an individual to do that, again, I could only go by what I'm reading. I don't know. But what I do know is that this is something that the security community has been looking at for some time: access control, rights management, and monitoring. How do you protect yourself against that? And you can have the best plan, and the best case scenario is that will never happen to us. Now, you hear about all these breaches that are taking place, and you go from Target to Home Depot to Equifax, and those are just the highlights. You know, keep going down, Marriott and all the other companies that are out there. No one is immune. Do you think they had a plan in case something went wrong? Yes, most likely. Did they exercise their plan? Did they test it to failure to where now their plan was not good enough and now a breach did occur, and what are we going to do now? To evaluate the resiliency of both not both, but of the system, of the individuals, of the plans, of the leaders, of the teams, of the infrastructure, you have to challenge it or test it to a breaking point. When we would do our military exercises, if we were the ones being tested, we never won. We always got exploited or got beat up by the enemy. It wasn't because the enemy was better, or it wasn't because we were bad. It's we were tested to our breaking point so that we could learn from that and have a plan that if these things occur, what are we going to do next? Because defeat is not an option. We have to be resilient. We have to get back up. And the idea of practicing your response, having a plan, not where you're the victor every time, but in an event that something does occur, what are you going to do now? And we find that a lot of organizations fail to continue their planning beyond them doing everything right. Something still failed or something still went wrong. Now is when the organization has to respond to that crisis. And it's not just the IT team's responsibility. It's not just the CISO, the CIO. This is a whole of organization response that has to take place, because no one is talking about the CISO's failure at Twitter. They're talking about this happened at Twitter. This happened at Home Depot. This happened at Target.
Yeah, I mean, everybody's responsible. And I really like that you bring so much of your military background into what you do. The stories you're telling, the way you're speaking to this makes so much sense. Now, when you think about the future, one of the questions we ask on this show is, where do you see technology going within the next year?
So within the next year, where should it go? Where do I want it to go? I'll answer that instead. I want security to be more usable at the endpoints, at the user level. We talk about the security gap of information professionals. There are millions of jobs available, and we don't have enough people to fill them. One of the challenges we have is that we want people with a lot of experience to fill entry-level jobs, but we aren't yet in sync as a discipline where we have codified, professionally recognized start points for information security professionals. And that has to do with the technology that they would be using, as well as their education and their experience. And IBM, we're working with community colleges. We're working with a lot of different organizations, both public and private, to emphasize that the education and training and experience is important. And the technology, the processes, the people, the practice, all has to move forward together. And it's not going to be just one silver bullet that is going to fix everything. The discipline is still relatively young in comparison to other disciplines like the transportation sector. We have a lot that we can do right now. There are tools out there. I mentioned some already: SIEM, SOAR, endpoint security, threat intelligence. Even though organizations have these tools, they're not maximizing the use of those tools. And also the people and the processes getting all of that involved. So it's not just one thing that I'm hoping will change in the future, in the near future. It's this whole system of information security. And maybe we have the term wrong. There's other discussions on that, on data protection, on personal protection, information security. But the idea is that we have to evolve together, from the end user to the most technical person. There's a role in security for all of us, and we have to embrace that role.
JC, we talked about a lot of stuff today. You've brought so much knowledge and background. If people want to learn more about what we talked about, where is the best place to do that?
There's a lot of sources. I work with IBM, so you can Google IBM Security and you will find a wealth of information on there. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I will point you to different sources. I would also tell you there are a lot of public-private organizations out there that are doing work together, like InfraGard, working with the private sector and the FBI to share threat information. And there are other groups like that. And for the individual who wants to get involved with cybersecurity, I would tell you to open a book. There's great reading lists from different genres that have the potential to inspire you to get more involved. And these aren't technical books on how to do something. There are those also, but there are some great writers that bring cybersecurity to life and the threats that are out there. And you read some of these books, and we call them gateway books. because they inspire people to get involved. And if you connect with me on LinkedIn, I'll be glad to send you a reading list on that. There are several sources. I can't list them all, but there are some great reading lists out there, and every professional should have a favorites on their reading list. And for those who are interested in getting involved, there's lots of recommendations. I'd be glad to share my list.
Well, thank you again so much, JC, for being here, for sharing all this information with us. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
If you like this episode or have a question, join the discussion on Twitter at Ingram TechSol with the hashtag B2B Tech Talk. Thank you for tuning in and subscribing to B2B Tech Talk with Ingram Micro.
You've been listening to B2B Tech Talk with Ingram Micro, hosted by Carrie Roberts. This episode was sponsored by Ingram Micro Security. B2B Tech Talk is a joint production by Sweetfish Media and Ingram Micro. Ingram Micro production handled by Laura Burton and Christine Fan. To not miss an episode, subscribe today in your favorite podcast platform.